Right, so hi, I am Megan Gimber. I work for People's Trust for Endangered Species, and technically I'm the Key Habitats Officer, but generally I just introduce myself as the hedgerow geek because that's sort of what I'm what I'm known as, and describes what I do.
So today I'm going to come at hedges from a myth-busting perspective. There's a lot of nuance about hedges that often goes unspoken about, and much more nuance than people realise. So I'm going to tell a few potentially interesting stories about hedgerows, maybe ones that you have or haven't heard before, I don't know. And I'm going to try and tick off some of the following myths. So first we're going to do hedges are a man-made habitat, so they're not as good as natural habitats. Then we're going to look at hedges are just a line of bushes, so they can't be that good. Then we will bust the myth that we planted all of our hedges in the enclosure period, therefore they're not very old, and by implication, not very important. And hedges lost their value when we got barbed wire. That's one I'd like to see gone. Or that farmers don't care because they ripped out half of our hedges, or that the flailing is what's killing our hedges as well. So those are the myths we're going to start with today. So number one, hedges are a man-made habitat, so aren't as good as natural habitats. So as to how and why hedges are as good as they are for wildlife, it's really complicated, but I find it fascinating. I think the important thing to realize is that in structure, they mimic the wonderful habitat that we get at the edge of a woodland. And actually, we call these woodland edge ecotone habitats. So for hedges, that means they've got elements of woodland in the trees. They've got elements of flowering scrub and the things like the blackthorn and the hawthorn. And they've got elements of pasture. Now, if you've got a ditch, you can also add another circle to this and add a small element of wetland as well. And for some species, you know, some what we would normally call woodland species, that means hedgerows are often able to accommodate a lot of that. So for example, 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species actually can be accommodated and live in hedgerows as well. And then there are plenty of different species that actually this combination of features is greater than the sum of its parts. And they're actually dependent on more than one or even all three of these elements to support their natural life cycle. So my favorite example of this, and there's many examples of this, but my favorite example is a song thrush. So that will sing from hedgerow trees, which is a very important sort of territory marking behavior. They'll nest in the dense structure of the woodland, of the flowering scrub, of the sort of hedge density itself, feed on snails and worms in the base at the margins, and actually move on to hedgerow berries later in the year. So for it to really complete its full life cycle, actually needs all of those different elements of that structure. Similarly, a dormouse might feed on the flowering scrub and fruiting scrub plants, but then also on ash keys and insects from the hedgerow trees. It'll weave breeding nests into the protection of the scrubby structure, but then make its winter hibernation nests at the ground level in the sort of pasture-like margins as well. So again, needing all of those elements for a dormouse to be sustained by a hedge. Now, the reason this is such a fantastic set of structures, and the reason that wherever we find this sort of woodland edge kind of habitat is so, you know, fantastic for wildlife, I think is really interesting. And that's in we think it's a similar combination of features to what our pre-agricultural wildwood would have looked like. So not wall-to-wall closed canopy woodland, but actually much more evidence that our before agriculture, that the land was a more mosaic, a successionary habitat, one that sort of changed, one that was dynamic, with constantly in motion through the grazing and the browsing and the crashing of large herbivores, which we had plenty of. So there would have been patches of woodland, but there would have also been glades, areas of scrub and pasture with scattered trees, scattered open canopied trees. But there would have been no harsh dividing land between any of this. You know, we didn't have a fence between our woodland and our field, but actually they bled into each other much more, giving us much, much more of this wonderful woodland edge ecotone. And if we think of it that way, this wonderful mosaic of habitats constantly moving with that woodland edge structure, if that's what our wildlife adapted to in this country, then perhaps it explains why the cultural habitats, the man-made habitats, so traditional orchards, wood pasture and hedgerows, are so rich in wildlife. Because when it comes down to it, our hedgerows are this exact same structure, but just sort of squeezed into narrow corridors. So we don't allow them to maybe encroach into fields so much anymore. We do need to be farming within the fields, but actually they maintain this wonderful dynamism through being managed on a life cycle. So they've got scattered trees and open canopied trees in the hedgerow trees. They've got that flowering scrub. They've got in the margins that grazed pasture, and that mimics pre-agricultural wildwood. And conveniently, the way of keeping it in this fantastic condition, which is this sort of wonderful dynamic succession, it constantly changes through time, it will mature through its wonderful succession periods, and then we'll reset it. That is just the traditional way that we've always managed hedges, which is fantastic. So we basically want to keep our hedges in what I like to call the Goldilocks stage of growth and succession, part of their natural life cycle. And when we do this, they can be absolutely fantastic for wildlife. So one of my absolute hedgerow heroes is a chap called Robert Walton, who is the chair of the Devon Hedge Group, and he's a farmer and an ecologist. And he went out and looked at, I think, one of the hedges on his farm. It was an 85-meter stretch of hedge, so not long. That's what, 3 double-decker buses or something like that, 4 double-decker buses. And he looked at that hedge for 3 solid years and counted 2,070 different species living in that hedge, which is, I think, absolutely mind-blowing. Now, Rob thinks that true number is more like 3,000 species in that one hedge, because he couldn't identify everything that he found, and he was only looking at things that you could see with the naked eye. But, you know, even 2,070 different species in just 85 meters of hedge, I find is absolutely mind-blowing amount of diversity. So when you think about it like this, this is our benchmark. This is what most hedges can obtain as and when we decide to manage them in a way that shows a lot of those characteristic features. So how do they do this? Fantastic for wildlife in 3 ways. Number 1, physical home. Things physically live in a hedge. This is a picture of dormice. They're happy living in a hedge, but think nesting birds, hibernating hedgehogs, small mammals, bumblebees, all sorts of insects physically live in hedges. Number 2, a complementary habitat. So a lot of wildlife might not necessarily live in your hedge, but it will still be using it. Now, this might be food, that could be leaves, that could be pollination, or it could be, you know, this lovely barn owl who's currently hunting up and down a hedge looking for small mammals, or it could be for shelter. And lastly, wildlife corridors. I think this is the one that most people are familiar with. Fantastically important as wildlife corridors. And this means we're connecting up populations of different species that would otherwise be isolated. And if you've got a population that's isolated, that makes it much more vulnerable to local extinction. And this is really important. I mean, I've got a picture here of something with wings, and I've done that for a reason. You'd normally think something with wings wouldn't necessarily need the connectivity of a hedgerow, but actually it's also really important for things like butterflies, which will sit on the sunny or leeward side of a hedge, gain that body temperature that it needs to fly, and then fly along the sheltered side of a hedge. Similarly, if you can see on this picture, there's a bat here. Bats are fantastic. They use a hedge for all 3 of those elements. They may roost in hedgerow trees, particularly big old veteran hedgerow trees. They will feed on the insects that a hedgerow provides, and a hedge can provide enormous biomass of insects, which is fantastic. And then, of course, they echolocate. So they move through the countryside using hedgerows, basically a bit like we use roads to get from A to B and to navigate across the countryside. Hedgehogs also use hedges for all 3 of those ecological roles. They may put their summer nests, and they're also their hibernation at the base of a hedge, in that thick protective element at the base. They bimble along linear features, so they'll use hedges to navigate the countryside where they've got the protection of the hedge if they need to escape. And they also feed in those hedgerow margins. And dormice, again, dormice are fantastic species. We think of them as woodland species, but they're very, very happy in a hedgerow as well, as long as the hedge is good enough. And I think that's really important. So to be good enough for a dormouse, they're fairly fussy. That actually means they have to be in a very good condition. They need to be a mixed species hedge, because a dormouse changes what it eats through the year, but they also need to be big enough and displaying all of their flowers and fruits. So there we go. Hedges are a man-made habitat, so aren't as good as natural habitats. I think we can dispel that myth. They are a man-made habitat, or maybe I should say man-shaped habitat, or maybe even human-shaped habitat. But actually in structure, they echo that long-lost structure of our ancestral pre-agricultural wildwood. And partly due to that, they have an absolute goldmine for wildlife, or at least they can be. Myth number 2. Hedges are just a line of bushes. Well, hedges can be just a line of bushes, so that's not a huge, it's not entirely a myth, but I would say there's a lot more to them than that, or at least there can and should be. So I'm going to go through in the next few slides what we want to see in a good hedge. What's the structure of a good hedge for wildlife? Now, first of all, let's focus on that line of bushes. What we want to see in that line of bushes is a good mix of different plant species. Now, this makes it much better for wildlife, but it also makes it more resilient for us as well. Much better for wildlife because each plant tends to have something that specializes on feeding or living in it. So the more plant species you've got, the more specialists that hedge can accommodate. But also the more species you've got in your hedge, they all flower and fruit at different times of year. So that means you'll have a longer floral period and a longer fruiting period, which actually makes it a much better habitat, as it's providing food for a large proportion of the year. Now, even if wildlife wasn't our aim, I would still be planting mixed species hedges. And that's largely because they can often be more resilient to our management, but also in a time where we know we're facing climate change and we know some of the things that's likely to throw at us, so heat waves, droughts, flooding, having a mix of different species might make that hedge more resilient and future-proof into the future. So I think that's really important, as well as it always feels like there's another tree disease on the horizon, so I think it's really important to make sure there's a mix of species, not only in the hedgerow bushes but also in the trees, to make sure that if the next hedgerow tree disease comes along, it's not going to wipe out everything. And there we have a lovely illustration to demonstrate the different seasons within a hedge of flowering and fruiting. So the more plants we have in that hedge, the longer it's going to provide food for wildlife. Next up, we want hedges big, really. We want them bigger, or at least we want them bigger on average than we've got them now. So bigger hedges are better for wildlife. Partly because they are just bigger, so there's more habitat volume, but actually they're a more complex habitat as well, which makes them better for nesting birds, reduces predation, all sorts of things. When I say this, actually, I should contextualize. Even big hedges we cannot keep to the same point. We do need to, again, back to the idea of them having their superpowers from their dynamism. We need them to keep changing and going through their successional process and go through their natural life cycle. So at some point, a hedge is going to get so big that we decide to chop it back down again and let it regrow. But certainly, I think we could afford to have our hedges bigger on average across that network than we do at the moment. We also would love to see hedges with structural complexity. So different types, different sizes, different shapes, different densities, different management styles, all reflected across the countryside at any one time. This basically is because, what suits a linnet or a yellowhammer doesn't suit a turtle dove. So actually having hedges of all different types across the countryside at once is the best way of actually making sure we can accommodate all the wildlife that relies on them. But actually, happily, it's also the natural product of managing our hedges on their life cycle. Because if we are managing them on a life cycle, we get them to go through their succession and then we reset them with a rejuvenation, like a coppicing or laying, and then let them go through their succession again. We will always have hedges at different points of their life cycle showing this wonderful structural complexity. So we want hedges, this line of bushes, to be well connected. We don't want them to be too gappy, but we also really want them to connect up other habitats. And actually, especially with that ecological role number 3, connectivity, there's plenty of species that doesn't live in a hedge, but they use them for the connectivity. So with the best will in the world, the centre of a field is often inhospitable to wildlife crossing across it. So it's hedges that actually will provide routes for things to get from one pond to another, or from one woodland to another, and making sure we've got that connectivity is really important. The margin. A lot of people forget to talk about the margin when they're talking about hedges, but the margin is crucial to a hedgerow system. So over 40% of the priority species that depend on hedgerows use the margins. Now, for birds, this might be nesting birds will pop out of their nests. They'll sit on maybe a bramble or a blackthorn outcrop, check that the coast is clear, and then go into the margin to feed. But then other things will physically live, nest, and overwinter in the tussocky grass of the margin itself. So those margins are absolutely fantastic for wildlife and need a good sort of approach to rotational management as well. Now we want our hedges extending all the way to that down to the ground. This is really, really important. I like to think of hedges like Victorian ladies. They shouldn't be showing their ankles, let alone their knees. And hedges often do get leggy, partly through how we manage them and partly just naturally as they mature. So again, the life cycle is really important to make sure that we don't have sort of hollow bottoms to the hedges. We want all of that protective, leafy, branchy, thorny growth to go all the way down to the ground. And that is crucial when it comes to wildlife. And lastly, when it comes to hedges, actually, I forgot to mention banks. That's terrible of me, given that I'm a Devon girl. So as part of the margin or maybe underneath the hedge structure itself, some counties it's traditional to have a big bank, and that big bank offers, you know, a fantastic suite of other niches that just adds to that complexity of this habitat. Equally, your hedgerow might also have a ditch. Now, a ditch is brilliant. Anywhere where you've got soil meeting water, meeting air, is an absolute factory for insect biomass. So it's really very important for wildlife. But also, if that ditch is like a slightly wet ditch and wet throughout the year, then this often means like a whole new set of plants can grow there, a whole new and extra abundance and diversity of invertebrates as well. So really very important. And lastly, for what's a hedge structure, hedgerow trees. Again, when we're looking at the woodlands, the flowering scrub and the pasture elements, hedgerow trees are a crucial part of that. Over half of the priority species that live in a hedgerow rely on hedgerow trees being there. So again, this might be songposts, this might be extra nesting, or it might be the extra food that it provides. Because at the end of the day, when we're managing the hedgerow below, if we're going to be trimming that hedge, then it's not going to flower and fruit as much as it otherwise would do. So in a year where we've trimmed that hedge, it's not going to provide so much food for wildlife. But the trees above that hedge, the trees in and above that hedge, will flower and fruit regardless of what we're doing to the hedge below. So it's an added element of food and a bit of a buffer for that wildlife resource. And of course, some of our hedges, particularly our old hedges, maybe our boundary hedges, have these big old wonderful trees that we call pollard trees. Now, pollard trees show that hedgerow trees used to be an absolute working part of a farm. They were as much of a working part of the farm as anything else. They used to be rotationally cut for wood fuel and for timber, and that process creates these wonderful looking, fantastic habitat trees. So these have amazing nooks and crannies that make them really good, particularly for deadwood dependent insects. So insects that specialize on feeding on the dead and decaying wood at the center of living trees, which is quite a rare habitat nowadays. Now we've got 2,000 species of deadwood dependent insects in this country, 2,000 different species that depend on dead wood. And we don't know much about them because generally for most of their lifetime, they are little larvae feeding on deadwood at the center of these big old trees. So they're very difficult to study. But what we do know is a lot of them are very, very rare and increasingly rare as this habitat becomes, tidied up or less frequent. And we also know that at least 320 of those species are known pollinators. So they are a really important group. Sadly, we have lost a huge number of hedgerow trees. I can't talk about hedge trees without talking about the loss. The picture on the left is an old Ordnance Survey map from, I think, about the 1860s. And the picture on the right is the exact same piece of land, but as that looks today. Every single one of the dots on the left-hand picture is a mature hedgerow tree. And these trees were valuable enough to us that we mapped every single hedgerow tree in the entire country in those old Ordnance Survey Epoch 1 maps. So really valuable. But you see how many we've lost. Now, that wasn't because we cut them all down. That's not the full story. We actually lost a lot to Dutch elm disease. We're losing loads now to ash dieback. And over the past sort of 70-ish years, the way we've been managing hedgerows hasn't allowed new trees to establish because we've been trimming them and not doing the rejuvenation. Which also means the trees that we do have left are on the aging side of the spectrum. So we definitely need to put a bit more focus into developing young, new hedgerow trees. And part of the way we can do that, this is my favorite way of doing that, is actually when we come to laying hedges and when we come to rejuvenating hedges this way, whenever we find a stem that we think, well, this will make a good hedgerow tree, we can leave that one standing. So we lay everything else down as part of that rejuvenation cycle, leave a couple of trees standing, and they are there already fantastic, rooted, already got a decent canopy as new hedgerow trees. Now, my favorite, the reason this is my favorite way of doing that is actually that those hedgerow trees, which will be fruiting and spreading their seed as the natural regen source throughout the countryside, will be representing the genetic heritage of the hedge from which it's come. So we haven't just planted it in from nursery stock, which tends to be slightly lower diversity. We've actually allowed the natural heritage, genetic heritage of that hedge to shine through. And that's going to be really important because our hedges are hugely diverse. And we know we're going to need that diversity when it comes to climate change. We're going to need all the various different genes for drought tolerance or flood tolerance or disease resistance that our natural tree populations have as part of their sort of diverse genetics. Of course, we can be planting hedgerow trees as well. Planting them in gaps is a great opportunity. This is an old enclosure hedge, so it's hawthorn dominant. And I think whenever we want to be planting a hedge tree in a gap, that's a great idea. We can also use it as a good excuse to diversify that hedge. Put a few more different species in when we're gapping it back up again. So there's a lot more about hedges than just the bushy bits. And some of the features they contain, especially when they're in good structural condition, the more wildlife they can accommodate. So if you've just got bushes, you've got a certain suite of things. If you've got bushes and trees and ditches and margins, then you can accommodate a whole load more. Hedge myth number 3. We planted all of our hedges in the enclosure period, so they're not very old. Now, there is some truth to this. The origin of a hedge, the origin story of a hedge, has a really big impact on the structure and the wildlife that you find in that hedge. Not all hedges have the same origins. And of course, yes, the enclosure period hedges, which are the ones often people think about when they think of hedges, are the ones that we planted. Now, we planted about 200,000 miles of hedging during the Enclosures Act. And for those that aren't familiar with the Enclosures Act, this was where we had a large-scale change of farming, and a lot of the common land was hedged in, basically, and then privatised, essentially privatised. And it went on for about 500 years, but peak enclosure was about 1750 to 1820. And the hedges that we planted in the Enclosures Act tended to be hawthorn dominant. Occasionally you'd get some holly and some hazel in there if you're lucky. And if hedgerows could be boring, I would say Enclosure Act hedges are probably among the more boring of them. And I would say that's because they only account for about half the hedges we have. The other half of our hedges are much older, much more mixed, and sometimes have really interesting and ancient roots. So the sort of stone-banked hedges at the top left of this slide, that's down in Cornwall. They're down in Cornwall. And some people estimate them to be up to 5,000 years old, which I find absolutely bonkers. And that actually would make them the oldest man-made structure that's in constant use and is still used today. Of course, Cornish hedges are slightly different for hedges elsewhere, but still a fantastic legacy, up to 5,000 years old. Dartmoor also has hedges that are Bronze Age hedge features. We've got maps showing individual named hedges in the same place for 1,000 years. Down in Devon, so bottom left of your screen, that's a hedge bank in Devon. That's just outside my house in Devon, actually. We think that 2/3 of our Devon hedges are medieval or older. And it gets even more exciting to me. Many of our hedges, what we call assart hedges, were actually created when we cut the fields from our pre-agricultural wildwood. So we might have had the wastes of the wildwood. When we cut the fields out of those, we left strips around the outside, and we turned those strips into hedges through dead hedging, through laying, through copsing, but created our hedges from that. So when you think about that really ancient and really fantastic long legacy of hedgerows, it's no surprise that when you find an ancient hedge, they're often chock-a-block full of ancient woodland indicator species, full of plants, full of fungi, and home to a huge proportion of our genetic diversity, to our tree and shrub populations. Not to mention the fact that the soil underneath these hedges will have been pretty much undisturbed and unploughed for as long as that hedge has stood there. So yes, we did plant a lot of hedges during the enclosure period, so they're not very old, only a couple of 100 years old. But actually, we think over half of our hedges are older than that and have a much more interesting history. Hedge myth number 4. Hedges lost their value when we got barbed wire fences. Now, this is quite a pervasive one. I get told this one all the time. But firstly, let me assure you that keeping the cows in was never the only value of our hedges. As valuable as that is, stock control was part of it, but it was never the whole story. So we're becoming increasingly aware about how valuable our hedges are for farming, as well as our more modern needs for hedges, so things like climate change and wildlife. This poster is on our website. You'll feel free to go there and have a look at a bit more detail and download if you'd like to. But I'm going to start with livestock. So what have hedges ever done for us? So with livestock in mind, they provide shelter, which is very important for the high welfare and again, the bottom line of our farming industry. This is particularly important for things like lambs. If you're having lambs in the spring, actually making sure that they've got shelter reduces their threat of exposure death and hypothermia in spring storms. On the other foot, we've got shade. Again, increasingly important with climate change. You know exactly where the animals are going to be on a hot sunny day. They're going to be in whatever shade they can find, and this is going to be increasingly important. So very important for things like dairy cattle, actually, who are a little bit feeble when it comes to the heat. Anything above about 20 degrees, and they start to suffer heat stress, and that might mean reduced fertility, reduced milk yield, reduced immune functioning, and reduced body condition. So very, very important that we're giving our livestock the shade they need to have a good life. But also, hedges provide a bit of biosecurity. They're keeping different flocks and different herds separate from each other, and also food as well. I mean, cows and sheep, they're not grass-eating creatures exclusively. Most of them are browsing animals, and actually having a diverse amount of forage that they can get from hedges is really important to make sure that they can be healthy and have a diverse diet. If you're not into livestock, then hedges are fairly good for crops as well. They provide a windbreak, and actually, instead of just stopping the wind like a wall would and creating turbulence on the other side, all they do, they filter out the strength of the wind, which actually is really much more valuable. And that means they can provide shelter far into the field. And this might reduce things like crop lodging or wind chill, and it's particularly important for vegetable growing. Hedges can provide pest control. So this is a ladybird larvae, this orange and black spiky thing. But also think, parasitic wasps, ground beetles, predatory spiders, hoverflies, all of these wonderful things that love to eat things like aphids, live in the hedge and the margin, and then commute out into the field to fill up on aphids and crop pests. They're not going to stop our crop pests, but they are just one of the tools in our toolbox to be able to reduce the impact of those, crop pest explosions. Equally, pollinators, our pollinator populations don't normally live in cropped land. They have to live somewhere like the margins and like the hedgerows that offer all the niches for them to be able to put their breeding nests and their hibernation nests as well. Equally important for pollinators is having food all season round. And hedges are fantastic for that. From the blackthorn and the willow that comes out early in the season, all the way through to the sort of late spring, through the hawthorn and the cherry plum and the damson. And then, late spring, early summer, that's when the margins take the mantle and the flowers in the margins take over to feed the pollinators as well. Because with the best will in the world, our crops will only be in flower for a couple of weeks of the year, and our pollinators need more than that to survive. Hedges can reduce our soil loss, and they do that in a couple of ways, by reducing the wind-blown soil erosion and also waterborne soil erosion. They are part of the problem part of the solution when it comes to flooding. Now, I can't promise that they're going to stop flooding events like the one that I've got on the screen. They're not. But what they do is help the water, when we have heavy rain or a storm, help that infiltrate into the soil. It's not that hedges suck up and use all that water. It's actually that the water likes to trickle down alongside their roots. So it helps that soil turn into a bit of a sponge and store it. Hedges can also store pollution, so air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution, all sorts. And of course, they can suck up and store carbon as well. And that's being increasingly recognised. There's a lot of research at the moment looking at how hedges store carbon and what we might be able to do with that information when it comes to planting hedges and hedgerow trees. Then, of course, there are loads of less quantifiable but extremely important other benefits, such as privacy, tourism, a sense of place, and I would say our general well-being. I don't know if any of you are similar to me, but I learned to identify plants from hedges. I'm a bit of a glutton, and it was what can I eat in this hedge was how I started learning, what the blackberries were and the damsons. I feel like hedgerows are a fairly defining feature of our countryside. They hold deep and significant cultural importance, and they tell a story of our farming traditions over many centuries. I would say you just have to climb a hill to realise how important they are to our landscape. That's why I've got this lovely photo from Shropshire when I climbed the hill over there. So there we go. Hedgerows lost their value when we got barbed wire fences. I think it's fair to say that the value of hedges has and continue to change throughout time. Livestock control was one of their many values. But as we move forward, we're looking at hedge values not just on farm, but also at the landscape level and the environmental level. Only now are we starting to look at hedges through the lens of wildlife recovery and carbon storage. I think the value we take from hedges has always been changing, but it's never just been about keeping the cows in. Next, farmers don't care. They ripped out half of our hedges. This is an interesting one. So this one is a lot more nuanced than it seems. So we went through some dark decades of incentivized hedgerow removal after the war, where it's estimated we lost about between 30 and 50% of our hedges in some areas. But I think to blame farmers for this, I think is too simple a story, when actually farmers were incentivized to do this by the government. Now, we thought it was in the nation's best interest at the time because we thought removing hedges would increase our food production efficiency. Now, given that we still depend on farmers taking behavioural steers from government grants, now are largely focused on wildlife and carbon issues, I think we should give the farming community more credit for not removing more when they were paid to remove as many as they did. So, this photo again. So I think we should look at the hedges that we've got around the countryside and realise that actually they only exist because of farming. They are extraordinary habitats and testament to thousands of years of care and management. Each ancient hedge that we still have only still exists due to an unbroken chain of care and skills passed from farmer to farmer through the many generations. So each hedge has to have been rejuvenated maybe once per generation to extend its life. And that's what's enabled them to still be here today. And anyone that's ever laid any hedges, and I hope if any of you on the call that hasn't already, I hope there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to learn it. It's fantastic craft. Anyone that's laid any hedges realise that this can involve blood, sweat and tears. So it's testament to blood, sweat and tears over the generations of farming that we actually have the hedges that we have now. And I think that's a story that we need to be singing a little bit more. And I'm glad to say the outright removal stopped. It stopped fairly swiftly, and actually the government started giving grants instead to replant them, which is fantastic. I think this graph is a brilliant one. It shows hedgerow planting in green and hedgerow gapping up in blue, and how that's changed in recent years. And those last two enormous columns at the far right of this are 2021 and 2022, showing how much more hedgerow planting has been done in the recent few years. It's brilliant. We're really, really getting on board with getting these hedges back in now. And partly this was on the back of an IPCC recommendation, the Interparliamentary Panel on Climate Change, who recommended we increase our hedge extent by about 40%, which translates to about 200,000 kilometres of new hedge. Now, the government hasn't been quite that ambitious, but they've still set what I would say is a fantastically ambitious target of 45,000 miles of hedge to be planted or restored by 2050. Now, that is enormous, 45,000 miles of hedge. Now, it's not going to be the government planting this is going to be farmers. And I think this is really exciting, actually, because before now, we've only ever really managed the hedges that we've inherited. And I think it's a really exciting time to get to design the hedges of the future. We've got 45,000 miles to plant and restore, and that's going to have a massive impact on the countryside. We get to choose where these new hedges go. We get to prioritise planting hedges that, I don't know, maybe best connect up other habitat. Or we can choose what's in these hedges. We don't have to just go for single species hawthorn. We can plant amazing mixed species hedges that will be better able to cater to the dietary requirements of our diverse wildlife. I think it's a fantastically exciting time. I will say, whilst it is very exciting, and I should absolutely recommend planting hedgerows, it's worth remembering that what we have now shouldn't be considered baseline, and that the hedges that we put in will take a very long time to get to the same value as some of the ancient ones that we're losing. So if we're ever in a situation where we have to choose between laying a hedge, keeping an old one going, or planting a new one, I would say go for keeping the old ones going, because they've got some values that a new hedge won't ever be able to replicate. And as far as for farmers themselves, now I deliver full day hedgerow management training with wildlife in mind across the country to groups of farmers. I do this all through winter, and let me say that I am completely oversubscribed, with farmers wanting to come to me and learn, or should I say relearn, the traditional hedge lifecycle management that keeps hedges thick and wildlife friendly. I see farmers planting hedges just for wildlife in some places, laying hedges in winter each year just to keep them in good shape and in good order. And I know many farmers whose knowledge about the wildlife on their farms and in their hedges would put many ecologists to shame. So I certainly don't think it's a fair assessment to assume that the farming community doesn't care about their hedges. So yes, in my experience, this is not true. Next up, the flail is killing our hedges, and it's much more natural to leave them uncut. Again, this one's a bit complicated, and to explain it properly, I'm going to have to take you through the entirety of the hedge management life cycle. So buckle up, we're in for a treat here. Now, there is sadly a nugget of truth to this, but again, it's only part of the story. We are risking losing many of our hedgerows, many of our ancient and old hedgerows, largely through the way that we're being managed. But this isn't just the flail. It's actually, I would say personally, more about what we're not doing to hedges than what we are. So the last CEH countryside survey showed that only 48% of hedges were in good structural condition. Only 31% if you also included appropriately managed margins, which I believe we should do. And that dropped to just 10% in arable land. We've also seen a 9% increase in the number of our hedges that have developed into lines of trees or relic features. So we are losing some of these old hedges through the way that we manage them. Now, this appears to be in part a result of hedgerow management changes and how we've changed in managing them over the last sort of 70 or so years. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go through what we think good hedgerow management looks like. And we're going to start right from the start. Now, Ellie said that you're going to be doing some hedgerow planting in Hampshire very soon. And I think this is absolutely fantastic. We need to be putting in more hedges. But what do we do to a hedge once we've got it in the ground? Now, how do we establish it into a good hedge? Now, to me, there's three really good ways of developing a good hedge once you've got them in the ground. I'll go through them in turn. So option number one is you plant your hedge, you leave it to do its own thing for about a decade, maybe 15 years, depending on depending on how fast they're growing and where you are. And then you lay them. Now, hedge laying, this is called a maiden lay when you're laying a young hedge. Hedge laying is a fantastic, fantastic craft. And for a young establishing hedge, it's a really good way of thickening them up. So for anyone of you that hasn't done hedge laying in the past, I'll give you a brief description. And apologies if there are any hedge layers in the room. This will be a very crude description of what hedge laying is. So hedge laying, you take all of your stems that are upright and have been growing, and you cut them at the very, very base, right near the ground. You cut them about 80% of the way through, and you bend over the top bit. That top bit is still attached to its roots, so it still grows. You bind that together and it creates a wonderful, dense living fence. But the beauty of hedge laying, a maiden hedge like this, actually is the regrowth that you get from the base of that stall. So right at ground level, where you make that cut, your stem is going to regrow multiple shoots. And what this does is it turns your 5 or 6 whips per metre, and it turns each of them into a multi-stemmed bush, making your hedge really thick and dense right at ground level. And then you can trim them slightly higher and slightly wider to increase that wonderful branching density to actually create a fantastic sort of dense hedgerow. Option 2 is very similar, although instead of laying it, you coppice it and then incrementally trim. And option 3 is you incrementally trim them from the start. So the reason we trim them is to encourage them to bush out. Hedgerows, the plants have this sort of, we call it an apical meristem, but basically that growing bud at the top, that's where all the hormones are that tells a plant to go for the sky. So when you take that top bud out, it actually encourages them to branch out. So when we incrementally trim them, we trim them higher and wider and higher and wider and higher and wider. And what we actually do in that way is create layers of different branching growth wherever we make those cuts. So we end up with a fantastically dense, thick, bushy hedge that's fantastic for nesting birds. This hedge was created in that first method. It was planted, left for 10 years, and then incrementally trimmed after it was laid. So this hedge is only 12 years old, believe it or not. Fantastic, thick, dense, fantastic hedge. What we don't want to see, and what we absolutely want to avoid, is letting our hedges get to the height that we want them and only ever trimming them there. If there is a golden rule in hedgerow management, it's that hedges put on branching growth just below where we cut them. So if we cut them at the same place every time, that's going to be where they put on the majority of their growth. And if we do this for young establishing hedges, it actually means we don't give them that chance to establish a good branching density all the way to the ground. So ideally we avoid that method. This hedge is roughly the same age as the hedge we saw before. And this was just left to grow to the height we wanted it and just trimmed it. You can see it's still got its spirals on. It's already losing a few stems. And if you've gone to the trouble of planting a hedge, this isn't what you want 10 years down the line. So what next? Once you've got your hedgerows, how do we manage them there? Now, if we just left hedges to do their own thing, they turn into lines of trees. When they turn into lines of trees, they'll often lose their flowering scrub. So that would be like the hawthorn and the blackthorn, which doesn't like being shaded out, which means you lose that wonderful protective thorny branching growth. Hedgerow trees don't like to sit at 5 or 6 per metre. So gradually they start thinning each other out. And over time, that line of trees will become increasingly gappy as individual trees are lost. And that hedge will be lost completely. And it's very difficult to recover a hedge once it's a tree line hedge. I'm not saying that tree lines are not valuable. They are fantastically valuable. But actually, at some point, you've got to recognise that a line of trees is not a permanent feature in the countryside, whereas a hedge, if managed dynamically, can be. So they do need management unless they're going to just grow up into tree lines and slowly be lost. But sadly, of course, if we cut them too frequently, and this, to me, that's cutting them every year and at the same height, it really damages the structure of our hedge plants. We lose individual hedge plants and they become increasingly gappy. Now, this Excuse the artistic license here. This is a hedge up in Northumberland. You can see there's a slight elbow in the hedge, maybe one, two, three, four, fifth hedge plant from the left. That's a demonstration. That's an old pleacher. So one of the ones that gets laid down during hedge laying. So this hedge used to be managed on a life cycle, but it's not been for a very long time. Now, excuse the creative license. What I've done here is try to show what we think this hedge will happen to this hedge if we carried on just trimming it and trimming it and trimming it at the same height. Slowly, 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 individual hedge plants will be lost as they get stressed out. And this will happen probably so slowly that you'll barely notice it.
Again tomorrow.
But this is exactly what we're seeing happening across the countryside, unfortunately. But luckily, this is completely avoidable. And actually, you know, if cutting at the same height and every year is what's damaging our hedges, we've got two brilliant, easy options. Number one, don't cut them every year. So this is a hedge cut on a 3-year trimming cycle. And you can see that third year to the right, it's got so much more blossom than in that first year. And this is because hedgerows generally put on flowering and fruiting wood on second year growth and up. So it's really important that we've got that sort of, that stage of wood retained on a hedge. And of course, if you don't have blossom, you don't have fruit. These two pictures were taken 5 minutes apart on the same hedge. The bit on the left-hand side, covered in berries, is managed on about a 5-year rotation. The bit on the right-hand side is trimmed every single year. And of course, on the right-hand side, that means we've trimmed off all of the flowering and fruiting growth. The other option is actually just trimming our hedges slightly higher and slightly wider. And this means you've always got a band of young wood around the outside of your hedge that will flower and fruit. It also means we're gradually getting our hedges back into that idea of changing and getting bigger and going through that wonderful succession. And this is what a hedgerow can look like if it's trimmed every year, but slightly higher and slightly wider. Just like to think what the countryside would look like if all of our hawthorn dominant hedges looked this wonderful. Brilliant. And then at some point, we might just want to give them a rest. Just let them get on with it. Leave them alone with no management for 5, 10, maybe even 15 years. Let them do their own thing. But at the end of that, what we need to make sure that we do, and this is one that's been through non-intervention, we need to make sure we then rejuvenate them. Again, hedges need that reset so they can go back through that succession, reset and back through that succession. And hedge laying is one of the brilliant ways of doing that. Now, this is a fantastic hedge, actually laid by Nigel Adams, not by me. I've never laid a hedge that beautifully and tidily. But hedge laying is absolutely fantastic. Again, it thickens a hedge back up from the base, and it sets that whole process of succession again. And what I find fascinating about this is it's the way of making hedgerows immortal. So no hedge lives forever unless we rejuvenate them through hedge laying or coppicing, maybe once a generation or so. And I think this is really fascinating because if you think of our hedges that are 1,000 years old, or they're 800 years old or something, that's 800 to 1,000 years where every single generation we've laid that hedge. And the way that works generally is when we make that low cut and we flop down the pleachers, the regrowth that you get from the base, that's the next generation of hedge. So as long as we continue doing this once a generation, we'll continue getting that fresh young growth from the ground level, right at that cut stall at the base, that actually turns what a hedge that normally has a set life time into something that could potentially be immortal. And in that sense, I personally see hedge layers as superheroes, as corny as that sounds, but within their billhooks and their axes is the secret to hedgerow immortality. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. And for those of you that want to laugh, I went to an AI website and tried to generate an image of a superhero hedge layer. And this is what AI thinks superhero hedge layers look like. The first one, I don't know, he's wearing some sort of hedgerow cape. I've no idea why the second one's got a stag head. And then I tried to narrow it down and I typed in hedge layer next to a Midland Bullock style laid hedge. And it gave me that fantastic thing, a cow made of hedge with a cape on his bottom. Brilliant. A little bit of tweaking and I did finally get my superhero laid hedge image. But those that look closely realize it's still not absolutely perfect. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't see hedge laying as a superhero, and a lot of the hedge layers I know often face criticism by people who don't understand what they're doing. So if you are going to be looking into hedge laying or hedgerow coppicing, I've created a poster that can explain exactly what it does and the magic power that it has to rejuvenate our hedges and give them an extra life cycle. So yeah, if you put all of that together, you get the hedgerow management cycle. And this is what we want to see. We want to see dense, well-managed hedges with periodic rejuvenation, and that is traditional hedgerow management. And the management here can include trimming. That's absolutely fine. Even by the flail, believe it or not, absolutely fine for hedgerow management, as long as we're incrementally trimming or we're rotationally trimming, and we're not doing it too intensively or for too long. Every once in a while, we then need to go and rejuvenate our hedges and then put them back into that trimming cycle. And it's that really makes them live forever. So this is what a traditional hedge laying cycle used to look like. At the top, you've got a laid hedge. Sometimes they were then left to regrow and laid again, but in the meantime, some of them were then trimmed. And the trimming is actually a fairly good way, not only of creating bushy, dense growth, fantastic for nesting birds, but actually also slowing down that life cycle. If you were going to lay a hedge and leave it and lay it again, that might be a 15-year cycle. But if you wanted to extend that, trimming slows that down, and you can eke that out into about between 30 and 40 years maximum. So again, you can actually extend the period of time before you need to relay that hedge. Now, unfortunately, we saw a lot of changes in the last century, and this is where the nuance comes in. And cumulatively, these led us to breaking with this tradition of rejuvenating hedges in this way. Now, we did this for a number of reasons. We used to have an awful lot more labour working on farms. In fact, in the mid-19th century, we had, I think, 6 times more people working on farms than we do now. And this means there was always labour in the winter to go hedging and ditching, which was a traditional part of winter farm work. Now, after the war, we lost a huge amount of labour on the land, which meant we didn't have as many people to go out hedging in the winter months. And if we didn't have the skills to do that in-house, then it became a profession. And as soon as it became a profession, it was too expensive for many farms to do, which meant we largely stopped rejuvenating our hedges. And actually, it's stopping this rejuvenation, the hedge laying, that has caused hedge decline, and something that we really need to work hard to fix. So the problems in hedge management are actually when we stop doing this rejuvenation. So if we stop hedge rejuvenation and instead we leave them to no management, they turn into ever more increasingly mature hedges, which can be fantastic for wildlife, but then they start turning into tree lines, and that becomes a struggle. Now we can reclaim those by coppicing and by hedge laying and doing a bit of gapping up. On the other side of the spectrum, these are hedges that we just kept trimming. We didn't stop trimming them and rejuvenate them through laying, we just kept trimming them. And those ones became gappy at the bottom, then they get a bit gnarled, then they start edging each other out and they get a little bit gappier and gappier and gappier. And again, these ones are retrievable, generally by letting them up to lay or to coppicing them and replanting them. So this diagram here, this is actually based on work by Nigel Adams, who I believe is giving another hedge talk in this hedgerow series. And this is based on his Adams code, which is a fantastic way of trying to describe the hedgerow life cycle and understand what that means, understand what you're looking at in front of you with a hedge, where it is in its life cycle, and what that means for its management going forward. So this is a hedge not being lost to the flail, but being lost because we haven't done any management. And you can see that it's becoming ever gappy. This one too, you can see this one used to be in a laying cycle. There's a few pleaches in there, but this one hasn't been touched. It hasn't had any management. And you can see all it's got is really leggy base and then a bit of a canopy at the top, but not the healthy hedgerow that we need it to be. This one as well, this one's not too far from me. This isn't a hedge being lost to over trimming. This isn't being lost to the flail. This is being lost to lack of management. You can see how gappy the stems have got. So much of that has already been lost. And this is now over mature and at the point of collapse. And this is just 3 trees. This was 3 trees that are left in what used to be a hedge that connected to ancient woodlands. So what should have been a very, very valuable connectivity hedge. And this, again, this was lost because we didn't do any management to it at all, not lost because we've been trimming it. That said, we also have been losing them because we've been trimming them too long. Again, hedges can cope with trimming as long as we do it sensitively and not forever. We need to occasionally put in some rejuvenation in there. So periods of trimming is fine, then periods of non-intervention, absolutely, and then reset through hedge laying. And that's essentially what we want. So how do we get back to this? We haven't magically got any more labour working on farms to do it in-house. And we're still at a point where many farmers can't justify the expense of paying professionals to come in and do it. Now, happily, it's taken some time, but seeing what the long-term implications of the lack of rejuvenation has done to hedge condition, the government has put much better grant rates to cover the laying and coppicing of hedges. And this is brilliant for hedges. This will be brilliant for wildlife. And this will be a brilliant way to ensure that that ancient and essential tradition persists. So the flail is killing our hedges. It's more natural to leave them uncut. I would say absolutely false. The flail is a tool in our toolbox and it can be used in a very sensitive way, but actually, in my honest opinion, it's actually the lack of rejuvenation that is damaging our hedges and an over-reliance on either trimming or not at all. So what are we doing? All of this information is it's quite a lot of information I've thrown at you. And what we're trying to do to support good hedgerow management, one of the strands that we're doing is we've got a couple of hedgerow surveys. So we've got the Great British Hedgerow Survey and we've got Healthy Hedgerows Rapid Assessment Survey. The Great British Hedgerow Survey is aimed at volunteer groups and enthusiast groups. It takes about 20 minutes to do a survey. And the idea is that it collects information that help people like me understand the hedge condition nationwide in order to help better support the conservation of those hedges. What it will also do is it gives you instant feedback about the connectivity, structure and biodiversity value of your hedge, as well as targeted management advice based on the answers that you've given to your hedgerow survey. The Healthy Hedgerows Rapid Assessment Survey is very similar, but aimed specifically at farmers, to the people that are physically, literally managing the hedges. So this is a completely free survey. It's only 6 questions long, which means you can do a hedgerow survey in as little as 2 minutes. It's based on the Adams code, the code that Nigel Adams has described about the hedgerow life cycle, and then 5 other questions. And it computes all of that and gives instant management advice. And the idea behind this is that we are offering a helping hand to any farmer that wants to return to that traditional life cycle approach to hedgerow management. It draws up all that advice and information onto a map, and it's color coded, but to also help put all of that into a farm scale context. At the end of the day, it's fairly easy to manage one hedge, but if you've got an entire farm of hedges that might need a significant amount of work, tools like this are designed essentially to help prioritize that work and help understand how to piece all of that together, you know, at a farm scale. So we offer the farm surveys. These will hopefully help demystify hedge condition and good life cycle management. I'm also going around the countryside doing plenty of workshops and talks with farmers. So that my winter is absolutely chock full of going up and down the countryside to farm cluster groups doing day-long hedgerow management workshops. We're also really involved in research. There's fantastic research going on across the country at universities, looking at understanding some of these wonderful hedgerow benefits and what we can be doing more of. And we also do a lot of partnership work as well. I genuinely think that we are all better connected, and we are very, very grateful to partner with CPRE and their fantastic Hedgerow Heroes projects, which Ellie is going to give a bit more information about, but also with other organisations like the Tree Council and HedgeLink, to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're working with a common goal. Ultimately, I would love to see hedges bigger, better and more joined up. That is pretty much the defining elements of conservation. I'd love to see them managed on a life cycle. with rejuvenation, and I would love to see more hedgerow trees being established. And this is just a nice picture of a hedge, but just to leave you with the idea that I'm hugely optimistic when it comes to hedges. I think we have been collectively waking up to the extensive benefits of healthy hedgerows. And there are some interesting things coming our way as well. So we've got the promise of 45,000 miles of new hedge schemes that are encouraging better management that will improve hedgerows as a home, as a food source, and as connectivity. And there's better and more accessible advice to help at every single level. We've got about 400,000 kilometres of hedge nationally. A lot of it actually could do with a little bit of improvement, as we've seen. But what I'd love to emphasise is that making these tweaks to the way that we manage hedges and this hedgerow network can have the potential to see rapid change with little to no encroachment on the land area that feeds us. The infrastructure is already there. We just need to be making the most of it. We need to be turning the hedges that we've got and the new hedges that we're planting back into the ecological dynamite that we know they can be. Each one of these hedges striving towards their potential of each being home to over 2,000 species. And I believe we are at that time. We've got fantastic government incentives. Farmers are really taking time to understand and improve the way they manage it. And I think we're just collectively realizing what we have to gain by doing things slightly different when it comes to our hedges. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. Yeah, I've heard your talk multiple times before, but you always bring a new aspect to it. So I'm still learning so much from you. Yeah, I love the myth busting layout of that talk. Thank you. Yeah, I just like the photo that really took my interest massively was that hedgerow that's absolutely covered in berries. It's literally just red, even though it's the winter. Just thinking like, yeah, throughout the winter, looking at hedgerows, you don't actually see that very often at all. You know,
No.
that was really striking.
Well, I hope we'll be able to see more of that soon, because we've had some significant changes to the way that government incentivise good hedgerow management, and the management that led to that photo is actually one that's now being supported in the sustainable farming incentives. So I'm really, really optimistic that actually we're going to be seeing more of that across the countryside as of this year.
That's really exciting. Yeah, I'll be keeping my eyes very peeled for that. Yeah, that's exciting. And I love it in the spring when you start to see the blackthorn flowers, and you know, I'd love to see more hedges that are really just covered in white. Really beautiful things. But yeah, thank you. That just covered so many aspects of hedgerows in the hedgerow world, and so you just seamlessly and eloquently covered that. So thank you very much, Megan. We've got so many lovely comments of people saying how great that is, and that's been, so thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, so I actually haven't seen that many questions. I have some questions, so I can kick it off. I'm just going to
shoot away.
Yeah, so I'll give my first question, because actually no, we've got someone who got a question. Chelsea, you give your question. So Chelsea Fenner, if you can unmute, there you go. You ask your question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Lovely,
yes.
go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. It was really fascinating. I've got a few questions, but you mentioned the 45,000 miles which could be restored. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, would it be more beneficial to start replanting these hedges in areas that previously had no hedges, or would it be better to look back at where hedges originally were and start replanting in those areas?
There's a big answer to that, I'm afraid. This isn't a simple one to answer. I think, to begin with, what we're not trying to do is recreate the past. We're not trying to bring the countryside back to a certain point in time. So to some extent, we don't want to necessarily just rely on the old maps. Having said that, the people that planted those hedges many hundreds of years ago often knew exactly what they were doing. So they put them in places that would actually make an awful lot of sense for the farming. So, for example, I've been to a number of farms, and they say, there was a hedge that used to go across this field, and that was taken out during the intensification period. But actually, it made no sense to manage these two fields as the same because they've got different soil conditions. So actually the hedge that was put in along that line was the line that separated those different soil conditions. And actually it makes sense to farm them separately. So whilst we don't necessarily want to just look backwards and recreate the past, actually looking at those old maps can actually help us understand where best hedges might be replaced. So yeah, a bit of a nuanced answer to that, I'm afraid.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
U doet ze comments.
I just looking through the chat, and we've got just lots of very complimentary comments. We have got a question that I just found. Where is it? Okay. So we've got an Eleanor saying, "Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I've been told that there are incentives for farmers to assess their hedges. Do you know how these work for the assessment?"
I do, yes. Again, I think this is a fantastic step forward because as Nigel Adams's hedge lifecycle, I think very brilliantly shows, the way we manage hedges should be dependent on where they are in their life cycle. Now, previously, if we wanted farmers to manage their hedges well, we've been assuming that they do that assessment about where they currently are in the life cycle for free. And so the hedgerow assessment action, I think, is a brilliant step forward because it's actually saying, yeah, we know it takes time to go out there and assess all of this and record all of that. But this is really important to good hedgerow management. So there are financial incentives in the sustainable farming incentives to actually make sure they go out and do those assessments and understand where their hedge is so that they know how best to manage it going forward. Now, with the sustainable farming incentives, there's no set way of doing these incentives. What they say is, as long as the method that you choose addresses the question at hand, then that will absolutely be fine. But what they do actually do in the guidance document is recommend the Healthy Hedgerows app that we built at People's Trust for Endangered Species. I find that both flattering and very scary because it's pretty much me at the other end of this, but it's basically an app that works on Nigel Adams's life cycle, but builds in a few other elements like base canopy, gaps, trees, height and width, computes that together and gives management advice. So again, the government's incentivizing that assessment, and if you do that assessment through the Healthy Hedgerows app, you'll do the assessment and get that advice as well about what's next, what's the next step for that hedge. Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Very much does. Thank you. Just gonna we've got someone who's got their sound on. Could you make sure all sound is off just so we can hear questions and answers? So just tap your audio off the bottom left corner. Thank you very much. So I've actually got some questions. So unless anyone else has other questions. Oh no, we do have others. Okay, I'll hold mine back. We've got Ellie asking, is anyone researching the loss of the humble garden hedgerow? I'm a wildlife gardener. It pains me to see hedges disappearing from our urban areas.
So it's really difficult, actually. It's difficult to map. It's difficult to it's difficult to ask people to map as well because it could be considered sort of snooping on your neighbours. But it is a worry because hedgerows are really important in urban environments, just like they are in rural environments. In fact, many of the hedgerows in semi-urban environments used to be rural hedgerows, but then obviously towns and villages have continually expanded. I don't think there is a huge amount of research going on for that. Also, partly because there's nothing in our legislation to stop that happening. So hedgerows in the countryside, the rural hedgerows, farming hedgerows, there's legislation to protect those. We've got the Hedgerow Regulations 1997, which has actually had an amendment just this year to accommodate some hedgerow management elements in there as well. But there's nothing the same for urban and for garden hedges. So it is a worry because garden hedges are fantastic for wildlife and really important part of that sort of urban and semi-urban ecosystem. Yeah,
absolutely. And I've actually just found another question. do the same hedge plants work in all soil conditions, e.g. chalky soil? Are some plants better than others? Do you know the answer to this?
No, they don't. And actually, it's a really good thing to think about. So when you're designing your hedge, if you're going to be planting a hedge, it's really good to design what you want in it. And the considerations that you might want to make are what soil conditions you've got. And you're right, some things don't work in chalky soil, some things don't work in clay, some things don't work too near the coast, some things don't work in too high altitudes. And I would say a really good place to start is if you want to plant a hedge and you don't know what the best things to plant are, have a look around you, go on a walk, see all of the other hedges nearby and what's thriving in those hedges. Now, I would say that's a good start point, but that's not the end of it. I would then say, go to your nearest ancient woodland or woodland system and look around the edges there and see what's also thriving in those ancient woodland edges, rides and glades, because it's likely that what's in those woodland edges will also work in your hedges. Just because whoever planted the hedges in your area didn't think to include those doesn't mean you don't have to include them as well. So and that might be things like wild privet or spindle or all sorts of wonderful things that you find in woodland edge. And then when you're designing your hedge, also think about maybe the floral sequence. So make sure that you've got a couple of things in there that blossom early, so that for those early pollinators, and then make sure that floral sequence doesn't have too big a gap. So you might go from blackthorn to cherry plum to crabapple to hawthorn, and then make sure that that's got a wonderful floral sequence. So again, putting lots of species in there and thinking about when they flower and when they fruit is really important. But there's generally information online about each different species and what soil conditions and what habitats it prefers.
Perfect, thank you. And also to add to that, when we've got a shady area as well, it's like choosing plants that are better with shades. That's always a good one to consider.
Absolutely. If you're going to be planting a hedgerow with trees in it, so things like an oak tree casts some fairly deep shade. So if you can future-proof your hedge by planting things like holly and hazel on either side of it, because they're fairly happy sat in shade, and that means your tree won't eventually shade your hedgerow out underneath.
Yeah, absolutely, smart planting. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of everyone else's questions, so I'm going to ask my questions unless anyone puts theirs in. So when you were talking about the different hedgerow establishment routes, the one where you would, instead of leaving to grow and then laying in 10, 15 years, the one where it sort of cut right from the beginning, what height would you say would be the first cut-ish?
Well, it depends how high they've grown in their first year. Have they poked their heads above the spiral tubes yet? The first cut is a very light one. It's literally just taking off that growing tip, and taking off that growing tip again creates the sort of hormonal balance in your plant to encourage them to bush out and put on branching growth from other buds further down. I would say in that first year, it can be, I mean, in some situations, it can be ambitious to trim them once they've only been in the ground a year, because they might not have quite poked their heads above the spiral tubes yet. But just a very, very light trim, I would say, for that first one.
Okay, not a coppice.
Not a coppice. You can do a coppice, absolutely, but wait 4 or 5 years, I would say, for a coppice. But coppicing a young hedge is a perfectly legitimate way of doing it, as long as you protect the regrowth from browsing animals. If you coppice your hedge and don't protect it, and then the rabbits or the hares or the deer get to it, then it's pretty much gone.
That makes sense. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. I always find that really like the scary concept of trimming such a young. Yeah. Yes. So that's interesting.
Yes.
What frequency of hedgerow trees would you recommend in a hedgerow?
So I think this depends on where you are and what you're farming for. I would say making sure whatever trees you establish in a hedge are useful and not necessarily going to be a pain for your farming. And there's ways and means around that. When Natural England looked into what they think a hedge in good ecological condition is, they said 1 every 40 meters on average. Now we are fantastically under the sustainable farming incentives, we are now incentivizing farmers to establish and maintain hedgerow trees at a rate of 1 per 100 meters on average. So we're not quite there at the levels that the Natural England would like us, but hopefully it's a step in the right direction. What I would say is it doesn't have to be equally spaced, and there are some parts of the country that suit having more hedgerow trees and some part of the country that suit having fewer. I would say we definitely need more, but thinking carefully about where we put them. So if, for example, we were growing crops, and so we didn't necessarily want so much shade in the crops, because that can create an uneven ripening and development of crops, then maybe our big hedgerow trees like our oaks or our beeches or our sycamores, we save them for our north-south hedges, because there they don't create so much shade in the crops either side. Whereas in our east-west hedges, we can put our little hedgerow trees like our crab apples or our rowan trees, or a plum tree, or something that won't get too big to cast too much shade. Whereas, of course, if you're a livestock farmer, shade might be what you're after, in which case reverse what I've just said. So it's all about, I would say, not just knowing how many trees to plant, but what species and where to plant them. Now, my favourite story for encouraging a diversity of hedgerow trees is a little group of butterflies called the hair streaks. So the brown hair streak butterfly is a hedgerow butterfly. It lays its eggs on blackthorn and young blackthorn, and that's why it's really a hedgerow species. But it tends to gather around large ash trees to mate. So it mate finds at large ash trees, prominent ash trees in the countryside. Whereas its cousin, the white letter hair streak, prefers elm. And its cousin still, the purple hair streak butterfly, prefers oak. So I think even within the hair streak butterflies, a sort of a little group of cousin butterflies, a diversity of tree species and hedgerow species themselves are needed to actually make sure that all of those species are accommodated. So again, you don't just need to plant oak trees and big whopping trees. A diversity of different trees in those hedges is really important, and working out what size they're going to be might have implications on where you put them and then how many you actually establish as well. So lots to think about, but lots of opportunities as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's just making me make a note, because we were lucky to get 40 trees from the Hampshire Forest Partnership, the Hampshire County Council. So we'll be planting some trees into our hedgerows that we're planting this winter. And I was looking at the species list, and we've got oak and beech, but we've also got rowan and crabapple. We've also got quite a lot of disease-resistant elms. So I'm going to be thinking about our north-south hedges now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it would be lovely to see elms back in our hedges. Of course, we lost all of our elm trees during Dutch elm disease, or most of them, but we've still got lots of elm in our hedges, because whilst it's continually maintained in that sort of successional cycle, it stays alive. It escapes Dutch elm disease. So yeah, we lost all of our elm trees, but not all of the elm itself. But it would be lovely to see big elm trees go back into our hedges. That would be marvellous.
Yeah, we've got some disease-resistant elms, and we've been planting them around a site where there are white letter hair streak butterflies. So it's quite exciting for that. But yeah, no, I'm quite unfamiliar with seeing elms. Like certainly don't see them very often. So often when I see it, I think, oh, what's that? And then yeah, it's in hedgerows where you do see it and you go, that's funny, what's that? And then yeah, you remember what it is. So yeah, it's nice to see them. Let me just see if anyone else has asked questions. I do have 2 others, but I'll see what other people have asked. Because we're getting very close to, well, it is 8:30 now. So we've got someone asking if you're on social media.
I am, yep. Mostly on Twitter, actually, or X, I should say. As actually, I'm going to type my handle into the chat, because it doesn't make very much sense when you say it out loud. So if anyone is on Twitter, I am under @favcolor_green. There we go. Type that into Twitter and you'll find me. I pretty much exclusively talk about hedgerows and trees on Twitter. So if you're into hedgerows and trees, which I assume you are if you're here today, yeah, follow me on Twitter and we can chat further.
Lovely, thank you. And we've got someone asking, what's the best time of year to trim hedges?
Again, depends where you are. I would say January, February, because that means any berries that have been on the hedge get the whole winter to be feeding our wildlife, and that's really important for loads of things. So at this time of year, the field fairs are about to turn back up, and all the sort of different migratory thrush species that we've got will be flocking to this country in order to gorge on all of our berries. So yeah, trimming in January and February, I think, is a really good opportunity to leave those berries on for wildlife through winter. That said, if you've got really heavy soil or soil that's likely to get really wet, then you can't often take your tractor onto the land in January, February, because you'll just do so much damage to the soil through compaction. And that can have a huge implication on the things that are living in the margins as well. So anything that might be buried underneath the soil, things like queen bumblebees and stuff that might be in that soil, we don't want to be compacting that in wet conditions. So in places where conditions aren't right for trimming in January, February, I would say trim, as late in the season as you possibly can. But you're allowed to trim anytime from September. And this is where things like the rotational and the incremental trimming really help, because actually it means if you're doing a 3-year trim, then you can trim earlier in the year, and you've still got some hedges that will have fruit on them.
Thank you. And we've got another question set up from someone. Oh, actually, I'm just going to say it is 8:30, so I appreciate some people may want to go, and we won't stay on for too long because I'm sure Megan wants to go as well. But there are links to our newsletter and volunteering page in this talk if you scroll up. But I'm just going to ask the next question, and then I'll post those things again in the chat so people can get connected with CPRE Hampshire if you're local or if you're interested in more of our talks. But I'm just going to keep going with the questions for those who are wanting to stay on a little bit longer. We've got someone asking, can I plant a hedgerow plant? So they're saying, I haven't got much capacity in my garden for a hedge, but could I grow hedgerow plants into a small tree? For example, hawthorn, wayfaring, field maple.
Yes, but hedgerow trees often take up more space than the hedgerows. So I would say if you've not got that much capacity for, sorry, have I got that question right? Not enough space for a hedge, but enough space for some trees.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say a hedgerow is actually a really good way of containing hedgerow trees. So you can plant several per meter, and allow them to develop slowly and incrementally, so that actually you're allowing them to fruit and flower, but not take as much space as a tree would. So actually, if you've got a confined space, I would recommend a hedgerow and then just managing it on slow increments, because that means you can contain its size better than you might be able to with a tree.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But if you are really just wanting one, I think the question also is talking about potentially one tree.
One tree.
And yeah, I mean, I guess the thing to add there is that all the hedgerow plants can be trees. That
yeah.
Trees through management. So
absolutely. And I don't think I could pick one. I think my answer would change depending on my mood or depending on what I'd seen most recently. At the moment, crabapple, because I think crabapple is a fantastic hedging plant. It's also just a brilliant tree. So
yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Is my today's answer.
We've got someone asking about whether the recording will be shared. Although you probably noticed I missed the very beginning. I will be putting it on our YouTube, and I might even be able to pinch the bit from last year, your intro, just to make it not so obvious that I forgot to press record. But I will be putting that on our YouTube, and I can send it out to people who've been on this talk. So I could send out some links, so for example the ones from the chat and the recording afterwards. But if you want to hear more about what we're doing, or get more spam from me, just sign up to our newsletter. We send out a newsletter every 3 months, so it's not actually spam. Yeah, and that's how you'll stay connected with the things that's going on and hear about things like that. Or sign up as a volunteer and you'll get weekly emails from me. Lovely. And so we've got one person asking about where could a farmer source whips and what might it cost? But I guess that's a very variable question.
It is, yeah. I would say when it comes to it, yeah, it's cheaper to buy whips in bulk. That said, I still strongly suggest buying a diverse mix of different species. I would also look out so try and buy from a local nursery, but try and make sure that the whips that you buy have been locally sourced. The seed source is a local seed source, because even though a lot of our nurseries will now be growing them from seed, they might not necessarily be getting that seed from near you. So I would say making sure that they've got a local collection of seed source is really important. And again, that's just to make sure that the hugely wonderful genetic diversity in our tree population is reflected in that next generation of hedge planting, because we are going to need all the genetic diversity we've got when it comes to climate change. So it would be a shame to restrict it to like a narrow selection. So yeah, make sure it's of local origin, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, if you do have a local supplier that is supplying things from local, it's fantastic to support them, because it's not enough. There's not enough of it. It's actually very hard to get hold of local seeds. So if you hear of anyone who does that, then support them as much as you can, because we need more people doing that. And I'm sure it costs them a bit more to do that, rather than mass growing of the same brothers and sisters plants. Lovely. So that's everyone's questions. I did have more questions, but I don't think I will ask them, because it's already 8:37. We've outstayed our welcome. But thank you so much, Megan. That was really
pleasure.
fantastic. We've had so many positive comments, and I'm not surprised at all, because every time I learn something from your talks.
Thank you. Well, thank you for sitting and listening to me chat about hedgerows on a drizzly Tuesday evening.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's a pleasure. And for those who want to hear more hedgerow talks, this was our first of our winter hedge-centric talk series. Our next one's on the 11th of December, I think, which is pretty sure it's a Wednesday. And that's Nigel Adams, as Megan mentioned. And we've got another talk in February, but I know that we have another one in January and March, but they're to be confirmed. So we'll have one all through the winter, each month through the winter, and they're all free and they're all online. So if you sign up to our newsletter, you will hear about those. But you also can go to CPRE Hampshire event page, where we put our events, and on there you'll see we run workshops and courses as well. So if you're wanting to learn how to lay hedges, we have lots of courses that are available through this winter. So yeah, please take a look at our website. And if you're keen to come out and do some planting, we'd be very, very thankful for people's help. In CPRE Hampshire are planting 5 kilometres of hedgerow this winter. We also did do it last winter, so we're committing to the same thing again, which is 25,000 young plants that are going to be planted across the centre of Hampshire. So we need all the help we can get. Me and my colleague Yolanda take out volunteers every week, starting next week, until sort of the end of February, or maybe into March, depending on how fast we get through the 25,000. So if you are local and you have some spare time, Thursday is when we go out. So it'll be every Thursday, and there also are weekend days. Will be one weekend day a month for those of you who are busy all throughout the weekdays. So I'll send out these links to everyone, because if you want to get involved, it'd be great to have you on board with us. But otherwise, with no further ado, I will say good night, because it's 9:20. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.